This is my journey. Inspired one story at a time, a library of leaders was created. It began as a journey to learn. As time went on, it began to grow. All it needed was a platform, and this podcast was created to listen, to inspire, to share. I am a storyteller, and this is my journey. Welcome to another episode of Profiles in Leadership. I'm your host, Steve Anderson, and today our guest is Dom Francks. Dom is a wilderness guide and the creator of VIVIFY. He is on a mission to foster regenerative leadership, blending personal vitality and ecological harmony. He strives to empower individuals to live and lead in ways that enhance their own aliveness and presence and create a deep and tasting relationship or lasting relationship with the more than human world. He's had a foot in two worlds for a decade. He has led wilderness immersions in remote locations, including Patagonia and Alaska, and he has held leadership roles at climate tech companies, serving as chief of staff at Terramera and head of product at Solara Energy. In a past life, he was captain of the Stanford University Golf Team. His work is inspired by the Animas Valley Institute, where he trained in the yearlong Soulcraft Immersion with Bill Plotkin. He has also completed coach training with the Conscious Leadership Group. He lives for movement in the mountains, and he has skied on the tallest peaks in the lower 48, completed a solo traverse of the Southern Sierra High Route, and ridden dog sleds across the Boundary Waters. So, Dom, welcome to the program. It's great to have you on today.
Thanks, Steve. Really appreciate it. And thanks for going into that bio. It's all directionally still very true. And yeah, it's always funny to hear your own words read back to you.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. So, give us a little context here to begin with. So, tell us where you grew up. I think it's intriguing that you're captain of the Stanford golf team. So, tell us a little bit about that, and then how you ended up doing what you're doing now.
Absolutely. So I grew up in Olympia, Washington, which is it's the state capital, if you remember from your fourth grade social studies class.
Well, I live in Paulsbo, Washington, so on Hood Canal, so I'm close.
Oh, wow.
So,
Beautiful. Love that.
yeah.
Yeah. So pretty close to you.
Yeah.
And grew up in a family where we were camping a lot, I would say, like some backpacking, but mostly just spending a lot of time outside, which was a pretty foundational part of my childhood. But I also think something around 90% of my thoughts until the age of 15 were about sports.
Yeah.
I was just really focused on baseball and basketball and actually later golf. Somewhere around the age of 14, really decided, I think I'd like grown up with all these sort of like the mythos of my childhood was to like dedicate yourself to an athletic craft. And so right around like 13 or 14, I really decided that golf was my thing. And I essentially spent like 6 days out of 7 playing golf for a decade, pretty much like
Yeah.
every waking hour. If it wasn't completely pouring rain and I wasn't
Yeah.
in school, I was at the golf course, which I can get into various things that I've taken from that. But yeah, I ended up being fortunate enough to be able to go to Stanford and play on the golf team there with a few folks who are now on the PGA Tour,
Yeah.
which was quite the experience. But for me, it seemed clear for a number of reasons, sort of midway through college, that professional golf was not the path that I was supposed to walk. And throughout this whole time, I'd had a really powerful experience when I was in middle school of recognizing the gravity of our situation in terms of our relationship as humans with the natural world. I think then I would have sort of isolated it specifically to climate change. I think now it's a much broader concern, a much broader issue. And so I've always known that I wanted to work on something related to fighting climate change slash addressing our as humans relationship to the natural world. And that's sort of what I've been
Yeah.
investigating in various ways since
Yeah.
then. Yeah.
That's amazing. Now, I would assume that since you're not on the PGA Tour, that maybe you weren't the best golfer on the team, or maybe that was just a choice. But how were you did you become captain of the team? Were you elected by the players or chosen by the coach? How'd that work?
I'd be curious if the other guys on the team, if anyone ends up listening to this, would agree with this. But yeah, certainly I was not the best player on the team. I actually, for those of you that play golf, I got the yips when I was a freshman, which is sort of like where
Yeah.
you really struggle to make short putts.
Yeah.
And so I think it was somewhere around my sophomore or junior year. In golf, you can break down your statistics sort of like from tee to green, which people call ball striking, and then as a putter. And I was like just as good or almost as good, I suppose, from tee to green as like the All Americans on our team that are now on the PGA Tour. And I was
Yeah.
like a 15 handicap putting, which was a really difficult experience because the yips are one of those things that don't necessarily get better with practice. And so it was
Yeah.
really hard to navigate with that. But yeah, I was captain. The other person on the team my senior year who was also a senior was a guy named David Boot, who's from England. He's still playing professionally, I believe on the European tour. And he was we sort of had this polarity of like being the two captains where he was sort of the captain that was honestly like playing better golf, but I was like the natural leader in workouts in the locker room. And that's like a position that I had gravitated towards with like pretty much every team that I'd ever played on. It always
Yeah.
came reasonably naturally to me to be like a motivator. And so we were sort of like splitting the duties on that last year, our senior year.
Yeah, that's really interesting because a little known fact about me is that I played college basketball, but by the time I was a junior or senior, I was pretty much the 11th man on a 12-man team. But it was a real honor that I got elected by the team to be the captain, even though I rode the pines a lot. So, I think people when they see leadership, they recognize it, and so sounds like you had a similar story.
Yeah, sounds quite similar.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about what you're doing now and what you're doing with leadership and coaching.
Yeah, absolutely. So to skip over a bit of the timeline, which maybe I'll come back to, now I run a program called VIVIFY, which is a wilderness-based cohort journey that's designed to bring the aliveness that many of us feel when we're immersed in the natural world into our daily lives, so that we can, show up more fully, both for ourselves and for the people in our lives, and ideally in some way for the rest of life on this planet. So, starting from that like high level overview of what the mission of Vivify is, what we specifically do is build coaching programs around week-long wilderness experiences in some of the most beautiful wild places in the world. So this last one that we ran this summer was in the High Sierra in California, which is one of my favorite places on this planet. And then over the winter, our next one will be based in Patagonia, in the Patagonia National Park down there, which has a beautiful conservation backstory, which I can get into.
Yeah.
Um, and really, the focus of Vivify is threefold. The baseline of what we're doing out there is essentially allowing our minds to reset. And I talk about this as like we reboot our minds. And that is both coming from the facilitated exercises that we do as part of the community, but also just from disconnecting from our phones, disconnecting from the constant stimulus that we're under in the modern world, and spending a week waking up to bird song, spending a week in relationship with the wind and the trees and the wild beings of a new place. And it is amazing the reflections that I see from people that go through our program around like day 5 and day 6 of being in the wilderness. They're like, wow, this sense of like bracing and this sense of acceleration and this sense of constantly being a little bit in a rush that I couldn't even really put a finger on that was going on in my
Yeah.
life has suddenly like melted away a little bit. So that's one of the beautiful things that happens when we spend time in the wilderness. And then another layer that we're operating on is something around rewilding our bodies. And I was sitting in like a health and longevity conference recently. So all these people are getting up there and talking about like cold plunging and different supplementation regimens and all these things. And I was like keeping a list of all the things that people were going up there and talking about that just naturally happen if you get yourself outside and stay there for a few days. Like, being able to go to sleep and wake up with the natural rhythms of sunrise and sunset, sleeping a little bit on the colder side so that you get deeper sleep. Um, people are talking a lot these days in certain circles, I suppose, about how rucking is really great for you, essentially like going for a walk with weight on your back. Well,
Yeah.
that's literally all you're doing all day when you
Yeah, exactly.
go into the wilderness. And so
Yeah.
another reflection that we get
Yeah.
from folks who go through our program is like, wow, that was a beautiful physical challenge, and I feel like refreshed and also well used in
Yeah.
a way that I think we often don't really get the experience of that in our world. And then
Yeah.
finally, we support people in what I call clarifying their vision. And this is really getting enough space from the day to day of your life, getting enough space from your normal environment, your normal stimuli, your normal rhythms to be able to think through and feel into, okay, what is most powerful and what is most meaningful for me to be spending my time and attention on in my life right now. So it's that separation of like new place, not connected to the internet, and then you get to really choose how you want to reintegrate. And so the combination of those three layers, there's much more, and there's much more to the broader coaching program, but that's really how we like focus our attention um, on these wilderness trips.
It's interesting you say that because I just experienced that in May, where my wife and I hiked down a Bright Angel trailhead off the south rim of the Grand Canyon, and then went down a 10-day rafting trip where we had no cell phone coverage at all. And it was crazy, I mean, to think that, man, all of a sudden you're just not connected at all, and you just have no outside information, and like you said, all those things, sleeping under the stars, and experiencing nature in that way, and bathing in a very cold Colorado River, and all those kind of things. It's pretty cool, and I'm interested in how you think as leaders when you're coaching people like this. So that's a great experience, and I'm sure everyone loves it, as did I. But then how do you integrate that back? So I show up after a week or two of doing that, and then I go back to the office. How do I just keep from getting in the same old rut and the same old thing I was doing before?
Yeah, great question. And um, yeah, certainly more I could say about reflecting on your experience in the Grand Canyon. But to your question, I think there's two layers here. There's the layer of, setting intentions about how we're going to change our behavior. And that's obviously a layer that's really important and is maybe the more obvious layer. And then there is the deeper layer of building signposts and markers back to the way that we felt when we were coming out of a week and 2 week long trip. And then, actually, perhaps even ahead of that, there's how we set ourselves up to reintegrate into our lives after an intense experience, which has a lot to do with how we navigate. So I'll take those sort of
Yeah,
in chronological order.
sure.
First of all, like one thing that I've noticed, I think I have spent more weeks fully offline than your average person that if you've pulled off the street in the last 5 years. And I have friends who spend a lot more time offline even than me. And like, so in this conversation, we've really talk a lot about how you can set yourself up for success or you can set yourself up for overwhelm. So it can be hard, right? Because if you're already taking a week or 2 weeks away from your standard life, especially if you have a family, you have a lot of obligations, it can be really hard to reintegrate slowly. But the more that you can create that space, I mean, maybe it looks like something like, okay, you're out for a week and you really dedicate the Sunday that you come back from this experience to just being with your family and not trying to open your email or accomplish anything. And so you can sort of stage the way that you walk back into your life. I think where I've seen people get really overwhelmed is when they try to like jump back into everything immediately. And then all of a sudden there's this like really jarring experience.
Yeah.
Um, so that's one piece. And actually, maybe another thing to say on that is that I actually think there is a way to experience it where having that experience of overwhelm and being very jarred when you come back into your life in the terms of, software engineering, which I used to be a software engineer, that could be a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
That could be like a highlighting of the level of intensity and stimulation that you're already living with. And so perhaps that discomfort that you feel when you walk back into your life is actually like a wake up call in some way. Um, so I suppose another thing is like if you feel overwhelmed coming back from even like a vacation or some sort of time offline away, that's a signal. and that's another like opportunity for you to learn.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so there's that piece. Then there's the piece of, setting clear commitments as you're walking out of your experience. So this is one thing that I find is really helpful, and again, that we get reflections on from the folks that go through our program, is that we, on our last couple of days, are taking intentional reflective time while we're still in the experience to say, like, all right, what do I want myself to really remember from this 3 days from when I get back, a week from when I get back, a month from when I get back? And I often find, like, yeah, you can write that as like a list of things. Like, I want to, not look at my phone until 9 in the morning. I want to, dedicate from 5 to 6 p.m. every night to be like close time with my romantic partner. Whatever it is for you, it fits into your life. Um, you can have those like concrete, more actionable things. I also personally often write those as a poem, which is sort of a way of gesturing towards like a more metaphorical understanding of, yeah, there's these different actions that I want to take in my life, but there's also a different way of being that I want to show up with. And that sort of brings me to the last point that I wanted to say, which is, a lot of times it's actually, it's both what we want to do differently when we come back, and also staying in touch with a particular feeling that we have when we're at the tail end of some real space from our lives, and we might feel meaningfully different.
Yeah.
I had one participant woke up on, believe, like the fifth or sixth day of our experience in the High Sierra, and he was like, wow, I normally almost always have some sort of musical element to one of my dreams. And last night, my dreams, the only music in them was birdsong.
Yeah.
And so it's like that's an example of how just like things are operating on a subconscious level that are trying to, like, we're being affected by our environment. So one thing that I love to do, and I got this from my mentors at the Animas Valley Institute to some degree, is to find a sound or a gesture or some form of like non-verbal reminder of how you want to orient back towards your life. Um, so for me and the folks that are watching on video will be able to see this, but other folks might not be. Coming away from an experience with the Animas Valley Institute, I had this gesture that was like this. It was like two hands coming together, like connecting in a very linear way. And this to me continually was a reminder of like, okay, how can I be sort of ruthless in the way that I simplify when I walk back into my life, rather than becoming pulled back into the like too many tasks and not enough time
Mhm.
that I had been in a lot before that. So that was a very long answer. Happy
Yeah.
to pull
No.
on any of those threads, but that's how I
No.
start to
Well, it
start
it
to talk about integration.
it reminded me too. Are you familiar with the inner game approach? From Galway, like there's the inner game of golf, inner game of tennis, whatever. And one of the things that he really talks about, and it's been around a long time, but is kind of going for the feel, like you said. For instance, we can get too overwhelmed. I'm not as good a golfer as you are. In fact, I'm not a great golfer, but I know enough to know that if you're totally focused on hold your elbow here, have the left knee here, have your foot here, do all these very analytical instructional pieces you're trying to remember, it's not going to work. But if you remember how great that swing felt last time you hit a 350-yard drive, and you just go for that feel, it's more of a kind of uh, it's not so instructional. It's more you just let it flow and let it feel. And I think maybe that's kind of what you're saying a little bit.
Wow, this is a very fun metaphor. I haven't thought about the intricacies of figuring out how to make changes in the golf swing for a long time. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a beautiful overlap there in that, yeah, you can have, I remember being prescribed like specific songs to listen to while I was swinging because they had a particular tempo and evoked like a particular rhythm that I wanted to swing with. So
Yeah.
there's that, and then there's also, the visualization and feeling into piece of like, okay, how do I want to feel as I like finish this swing? But then there is also a place for specific swing thoughts.
Yeah.
I remember one that I would use a lot was like, okay, I wanted my left hip to feel like it was being pulled backwards at a 45-degree angle by like an invisible string as soon as I started my downswing. It was like if I had one swing thought, like one concrete thing that the rest of my swing would organize itself around, it was like,
Yeah.
okay, I get to the top and then I feel that string pull on my left hip. So that could be another model for how we integrate from these experiences
Yeah.
of like
Yeah.
what's the organizing principle that everything else flows from.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. It's really interesting. So I have to ask a question because I'm going to just give you an assumption here, but I would think golf kind of, country club posh, luxury, and you went from that world into rugged outdoor, sleep on the ground, uh, suffer a little bit. Those are two pretty different worlds. It's intriguing to me that that you pursued that.
Yeah, I mean the way that I describe, I really get a kick out of now how long I can know people and how close I can get with them before they realize that I was almost a professional golfer. And the other way I describe it is like it's incredibly off-brand
Yeah.
for me right now. Um, yeah, I mean, I could speak to the through lines that I experienced, but I think more so, um, I think it's just a love for the full raw experience of life. I mean, I a couple of years ago had like a very intense experience at this dichotomy where a friend of mine from the golf team was getting married, and so I was in Palo Alto at this like pretty upscale wedding, and we all played a round of golf before, and like three of the guys on the range had like the full tour staff bag and like all the sponsorship logos, and I was like, I hadn't hit a golf ball in a year and didn't even own golf shoes anymore and had just been dirtbag climbing in Yosemite Valley for 10 days. And then right after that, like literally at 4 in the morning, the day after the wedding, I flew to Utah for a Vision Fast program that I was doing with the Animas Valley Institute. And then 3 days later, I was completely alone fasting in the desert with essentially just like me and my drum. And so
Oh no.
it's like a
Wow.
great, it's a great like, yeah, walking between these two worlds that I think
Yeah.
is just the path that I'm walking at this moment.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, uh, some corporate executive leader type signs up for your program, and you're going to take them on this adventure in the wilderness. Do you get people that are first of all maybe not in shape, secondly just way out of their comfort zone to where it's a struggle? And I'm trying to imagine that some of these guys are way out of their comfort zone. So how do you deal with that?
So on the physical piece, I mean, not just through Vivify, but with my work, particularly with an organization in Patagonia called Chulengo Expeditions that I've done a bunch of work with. Um, I've led dozens of people, more than some, fewer than others, on their like first backpacking trip ever. And I think many people, I don't know about most, but many people can go and spend a week in the wilderness. Um, it's you kind of have all day to walk 8 or 10 miles with a pack on your back, and you can kind of go as slow as you want. And yes, it's physically challenging, but it's pretty accessible for a lot of folks. Um and yeah, a lot of people are absolutely out of their comfort zone, and that is absolutely a feature of the experience.
Yeah.
There's a great book which I don't know if you've heard of called The Comfort Crisis by
Hmm.
Michael Easter that I think is just a phenomenally well argued and well articulated case that we're way too comfortable and it's making us miserable.
Yeah, yeah,
And
I think.
so
Yeah, and
it's
we as parents, sometimes try so hard to protect our kids, and
mhm.
that's not cool. I mean, they need to struggle to learn, right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. I mean, I would say the single person that I think probably got the most out of this last experience with Vivify was the most uncomfortable person. I mean, he was constantly pushing through all sorts of layers of self-doubt and fear and all these things that were coming up because he was so far out of his comfort zone. And that was a beautiful experience to watch. And I also think, recently in my own personal explorations, I've been getting into what some people might call like primitive skills or ancestral skills, which essentially like, okay, let's ditch the tent, ditch the sleeping bag, ditch the sleeping pad, ditch most of our food, and figure out how we can survive, with like a knife and a water filter and a very light blanket and, really, really minimal. And I did a 5-day experience like that in July in Colorado, and I'll be doing a 2-week long one, in a couple of weeks. And my experience on those trips, I think, was like similar to what some people experience coming on the trips that I facilitate, where I was like, wow, this is really uncomfortable. Like, I am hungry all the time. I'm sleeping and I'm like 5 degrees too cold most of the time, where it's not dangerous. Like, I'm not going to get hypothermia, but I have to constantly be like shifting around to try to warm different parts of my body. And, uh, and it was a real reminder of the beauty of that, like the beauty of confronting the raw experience of being alive and being removed from some of the things that honestly like separate us from the real world.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, well, there's so much in there that I definitely want to cover, but before we get too far away from, I want to go back to your captain of the golf team. So, what do you think you learned and what experiences did you gain in that to prepare you to be the leader that you are today?
So the two parallel images or moments that are coming to mind for me are when we were on the golf team, we would do this particular workout called the Versa Climber. And the Versa Climber, you can see videos of like LeBron James using this thing. It is an the absolute like most fierce piece of cardio equipment that I've ever seen. It's essentially
Yeah.
just like an upright pole
Yeah.
with a couple handles, and you just like go up and down both with your arms and legs.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's unclear to me exactly how this was going to make us better golfers, but I think it was more of a mental challenge than anything else.
Yeah.
But we would do like a 10-minute Versa Climber challenge. I don't know, once every couple of weeks, and it was like it was like mythical on the golf team. It was like, oh my god, we have to do a 10-minute Versa. This is going to be horrific. And I got it into my head to try to do 2,000 feet in 10 minutes, which to my knowledge hadn't been done by any Stanford athlete at that point. Now it's true that not all of the teams do the 10-minute challenge. So I'm
Yeah.
not here claiming that I was like the most fit athlete in all of Stanford athletics at that
Yeah.
moment. But um, yeah, essentially, my recollection is like I was so excited about doing the Versa Climber that it sort of like pulled everyone a little bit along with me, even the folks that were like, this is stupid. I don't understand how this is going to make us a better golfer.
Yeah.
And the first day to fast forward to our most recent Vivify trip, 2 hours into our time in the wilderness, this big thunderstorm came through right as we were coming over this pass. And I think, my experience of that was like, oh, amazing. Like we're like in the elements, and we're being greeted by the mountains as we walk into them. And I was obviously like keeping in mind safety, and I was like counting the lightning. I was like, okay, I think we're okay. It still makes sense for us to go over this pass. I wasn't just like blindly leading folks into danger, but so many people throughout the trip reflected on like, oh, a really meaningful moment was seeing Dom get so excited about the
Yeah.
thunderstorm.
Yeah.
Because I think most people think like, oh, it's raining. That means we should be sad. I'm cold now. This is uncomfortable. And meanwhile, I was like, this is awesome. Like we get to like we're
Yeah.
more like, don't you feel more alive now? And so I think this there's something in me that I think I learned a lot younger than that, but was sort of honed a little bit possibly on the golf team of like really joyfully embracing discomfort and challenge. Um, that seems to be a powerful part of what people take away from being in the wilderness with me.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so let's jump back into the adventure world. So, tell us a little bit. I was fortunate enough to go to Patagonia right before COVID, and just I mean, they call it Wild Patagonia for a good reason. It's just unbelievable. So, tell us a little bit about what you do down there in Chile and the national parks, and not only from the leadership perspective, but from the conservation perspective as well.
Beautiful. So I'll preface this by saying pretty much all of my experience in the Aysén region of Chile comes through Nadine Lenner, who's a dear friend of mine. She was my collaborator and co-guide on this most recent VIVIFY trip. And I've worked with her a lot on her project Chilengo Expeditions. So she lives down there. She has much more experience, but I'll relay what I know. So I've been down there a couple times now. Um, if anyone has seen the movie Wildlife on National Geographic, which is about Doug and Chris Tompkins. Doug Tompkins was the founder of the North Face. Chris
Yeah.
Tompkins, one of the CEOs of Patagonia. They got married and essentially dedicated the last like 20-ish years of their life to buying a bunch of land in mostly Chile, but also partially Argentina, and essentially rewilding it and then giving it to the Chilean government as national parks. It's an incredible model of conservation,
Yeah.
and a pretty inspiring story. Nadine was the sort of right hand woman of Chris Tompkins through that whole project. And she was like down there living in Chile, living on the land in what is now the Patagonia National Park, which is just south of Lago General Carrera in Chile.
Hmm.
And so what Chulengo does is guides, conservation focused adventure experiences in Chilean Patagonia with a focus on the Patagonia National Park. And it's this beautiful example where you can really talk through issues around conservation and how we relate to wild land while walking through a place that has been rewilded in the last like 20 or 30 years. I mean, you can still see some of these old like puestos or like little homestead houses that the sheep herders and ranchers were using in this valley that you're walking through. And also to acknowledge like the story of conservation is a complex one. There are people in Chile that think that the Tompkins, approached things incorrectly, and there's always like many stakeholders. So I'm not saying it's like a simple story
Sure.
here,
Sure.
and I'm generally in favor of more wild places. And I think walking through that landscape is particularly inspiring. And Patagonia in general, I think people think of the like jagged granite peaks and the Torres del Paine and El Chalten uh and like the Fitzroy Range, which is the range that's
Hmm.
on the company Patagonia logo.
Right.
Um, but Patagonia is massive. It's 1,500 miles or something like that from the north part of what people call Patagonia down to all the stuff that people think of as like the more popular touristy Patagonia. And so where I've spent a lot of time and where Chulenko is based is in a region called Aysén, which is sort of in the middle of the two, and it's just this like hidden gem of natural beauty. It has like the stunning granite spires, but it also has these like gorgeous biodiverse grasslands, and it is right on the border with the northern Patagonian ice field, and so you can go, and Nadine does this regularly. Like you can go on like multi-week expeditions onto the ice field and go into a landscape that very few people ever get a chance to venture into. So I think, Patagonia has a lot of cachet. The
Yeah.
name has a lot of cachet,
It does.
and there is so much to explore down there. And I think a lot to learn, yeah, from one of the continually still most like remote and wild corners of this world.
And I did see that film, and I remember that the reason that they started doing that wasn't the Chilean government kind of, just putting up plants or, tearing down forests and doing things that were just had no conservation at all in mind. And so it was a way to protect it. Um, have they done it in a sense now by purchasing the land and making it a national park that you think it's protected for the long haul, or does the next Chilean government get to do what they want to do with it?
I'm not the expert on this topic.
Yeah.
My understanding is that what it took a long time for them to transfer the land to the Chilean government, specifically because they wanted to make sure that that wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
That like the election wouldn't, there wouldn't be some change in election, and then all of a sudden the policy of the Chilean government shifts dramatically and this land's no longer protected. So I know that there is some aspect of the agreement that is dedicated to making sure that the land is protected going forward, but
Mm.
not my area of expertise
Yeah.
on the intricacies of that arrangement. But yeah, what I can say is it's like it's inspiring to see the way that the Tompkins really oriented towards creativity and thinking very far outside the box of the way that they could use their position and money to create wild places. And I think I'm particularly interested in the way that those wild places affect us as humans when we really dedicate the time to walk through them and offer our attention to them.
So, someone that lives in this world and experiences it on a regular basis, are you optimistic for our planet in the future? Are we making enough awareness and changes that there's hope? Or sometimes you get the feeling like it's just yeah, we're too late.
I think both are true.
Mhm.
In the sense that I think we are too late to avert many of the worst things that are going to happen. I mean, the example that particularly comes to mind for me is coral reefs. That I think we've really just set things in motion where, I think we're already seeing so much loss of these places, and I think 50 years from now, the movie Finding Nemo is just going to be like one of the most tragic things that you can watch, remembering like these bright and beautiful places that are now no longer on this planet. Um, but it's certainly not true that our actions don't matter. And it's certainly not true that there isn't a way to move through this that is oriented towards right relationship with the planet and an orientation towards beauty. And I think, I'm gonna answer this question from my own personal experience, not really pretending to be an expert, honestly.
Okay.
Um, and what I see is that we've been talking about climate change for 35 years, maybe more. We've had, Al Gore make big climate change documentaries, former vice president of the United States. We've had Paris agreements. We've had all sorts of, obviously not enough. We've had trillions of dollars of investment in various climate solutions. And if you look at the graph of like carbon dioxide emission over time, the only times in which it actually meaningfully deviated from its linear rise was the 2008 financial crisis and 2020 when COVID happened.
Hmm.
Both totally unrelated to any of like what you would call the environmental movement. Now you can absolutely make the argument that our emissions would have accelerated faster if it wasn't for the deployment of solar, the deployment of wind, all of these things. But I essentially think that we are not going to solve our problems through technology. I think, need a meaningful shift in how we relate to the natural world. I'm deeply concerned about the crises of governance all around the world. Um, but to come back into like a realm of speaking and orientation that I can really stand in, like I don't think anything gets solved unless we fall back in love with the living world. And this is in the last like 2 weeks, I've been deep down this rabbit hole of this guy Ian McGilchrist, who is a neuroscientist. He wrote it's one of these books that I think is brilliant, but I don't know if I can fully recommend it because it's 1,500 pages long. If you
Okay.
want to go really deep into
Yeah,
this stuff,
yeah.
okay. So Ian McGilchrist, the general point, as I understand it, of his work is that okay, many people have heard about the left hemisphere and right hemisphere of the brain. Then there was a time when that whole theory got debunked, but actually his research shows there are differences between the left and the right side of the brain. The left side is really, really good at executing tasks, and the right side is really phenomenal at seeing the whole. And so,
Yeah.
an example of this is that if you suppress the right side of the brain for 10 or 15 minutes, people start to see other living things and even other humans as dead. Like they don't experience them as like having life and having animacy. But if you suppress the left side of the brain, then people all of a sudden, 10 to 15 minutes later, not all of a sudden, are immersed in this world of animacy and meaning and interconnectedness, and they perceive the whole as sort of this like seamless process rather than distinct entities.
Mm.
So, without getting like too deep down the woo side of things, um, I essentially think none of this works. We don't walk out of this predicament that we're in without a meaningful change in orientation towards seeing the whole of the beauty of things on this planet. And I think one of the most powerful ways to do that is to spend time, intentional time, where you're really dedicating your attention to the natural world. And so, you know, honestly, like below everything else that I said about like what we do at VIVIFY and how we integrate this back into our lives, like below everything else is just how can we fall more deeply in love with this incredible planet that we live on? And how can we, remember the gifts and the miracles that the rest of life? I mean, I'm looking out this window at this beautiful forest here in Lake Tahoe in California. It's just, uh, you just can't make this shit up.
Yeah.
And yeah.
It's just really interesting because, when I'm out in wilderness, I have those same spiritual experiences you're talking about, and is amazing. But sometimes there's a part of me that thinks, well, if more and more people were out here doing this, it would ruin it. Unless you really do adopt the leave no trace, stance, it's not going to be what it was. So it's almost like we want to encourage more people to get out there and experience this. Yet there might be a cost to that too.
Absolutely. But what I would say is you don't need to be like deep. I mean, hmm, you don't need to be deeply immersed in the most remote wilderness to have these experiences.
Yeah.
And I think we are, one of the things that I am constantly getting reflected by people who walk into the wilderness and haven't been there before is like, wow, people really take this leave no trace thing really seriously. Like,
Mhm.
given the number of people that spend time in the High Sierra or other places, like, obviously it's not perfect. Sometimes you come across rappers or other things, but like, generally, wilderness travelers do a pretty dang good job.
Yeah.
And I think that the quota systems that the national parks put in place to protect these ecosystems are well managed, and yet I generally don't have a problem getting a permit for something like the time and place that I want to go.
Yeah.
So I don't know that it's like that's the key issue right now. And you can find something like this connection to the natural world right where you are. And actually, like an organizing principle that I really like to use that I borrow from Michael Easter in The Comfort Crisis is the nature pyramid, which he in turn, I believe, got from like an MIT neuroscientist or something. Which essentially, like, every day, if you can, try to spend 20 minutes walking in a wildish place. And that could be like a city park, like any place that's primarily green, that has trees, that has like some sense of feeling disconnected from the predominantly human world. And if you spend 20 minutes walking in that place without looking at your phone, and without, ideally also without trying to like figure something out, that is a meaningful and measurable physiological and psychological reset on your day. And it supports your creative problem solving. It supports your mental health. It supports all these positive things. And this has been backed up by science.
Yeah.
So that's like the bottom of the nature pyramid. Then the middle is every month, try to spend 5 hours in, again, a wildish place. This doesn't have to be, deep in the farthest recesses of the High Sierra, or you don't have to get on a plane to go to Patagonia. This can be going to a state park near you, going to any place that you can really like walk for 5 hours and not encounter too much sort of the human built environment. And my invitation for that stretch of time is to really wander rather than hike. I think like hiking can be great where you have a destination. Maybe you're trying to hit some heart rate zones. Like, I'm an athlete also. I do that. I wear the heart rate monitor and try to like keep it in zone 2 and all those things. And there's something so beautiful about just allowing your intuition to guide you and really making yourself open to, whatever your curiosity draws you to. So doing that at least once a month for 5 hours. And then finally, and this is the thing that, I think is the place that I'm obviously trying to play, is that every year you should try to spend 3 or more days in like a deep wilderness place. So this is like what you did on the Grand Canyon. This is like what we do with VIVIFY. There is something about the 3 day threshold that's scientifically measurable of like we experience like an improvement in problem solving abilities. We experience a decrease in stress. We experience a change in brain waves actually, which is really beautiful this happens after that 3 day threshold. And I also love that, independent of all of this stuff, Aboriginal Australians have a saying that modern culture runs 3 days deep. And so you've got like the scientific lens and the sort of like traditional indigenous wisdom lens sort of aligning on the same concept.
Yeah.
And so, I think in certain circles, we've seen in recent years like meditation retreats become more mainstream, and other ways of like stepping away for your own wellness and mental health. And I think the point that is I think I really want to drive home is that spending these extended times in the wilderness, preferably in like within a group that's facilitated, because I think that deepens the experience a lot,
Yeah.
should be just part of all of our like good hygiene for how we, maintain ourselves in our lives. But it's not exclusively that deep wilderness experience, because you also want to be like tending to that bottom of the nature pyramid. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Totally. That's very fascinating. So let's talk about your business a little bit. So you have a coaching credential, as you stated, we stated in the bio. You work with clients. Who's your who's your go-to client? Who comes to you? How do they find you? I'm just intrigued of what your typical client is and how do they get to you?
Yeah. So yeah, I've done coaching training with the Conscious Leadership Group, which that's a whole other conversation. We could go down the book, The 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership. I think it's just an unbelievable operating manual for how to navigate through the world. And then also Alethea coaching, which again, I could go down that rabbit hole, but sort of blend those two frameworks along with my work with the Animas Valley Institute. So my ideal client is really someone who is, I'd say, mid-career, and who has essentially like been in their career long enough to figure out like, okay, like I can see how this movie ends. Like I can see what happens if I just continue to
Mhm.
play this forward. And is that the life that I really want? Do I really want to be setting myself up for a life where, a lot of my clients feel like they're frustrated spending so much time behind a screen, spending a lot of time on Zoom, feeling like, oh, it's really difficult for me to imagine doing the same thing directionally for like 20 or 30 more years, and who feel some sense of what is going on in the broader world, are like various social and ecological crises, and who are asking themselves the question of how can I do something meaningful um, in that context. And so what I support clients with is, I like to organize my coaching work into three very basic questions that all of us ask: why, what, and how. So the why is the highest level of, why are we here? Like, what is a human being for? And while that can sound very vague and high level, I actually think it's foundational to have some opinion about what the answer to that question is, as a organizing principle for how we navigate our lives in general. If you don't have an answer to that question, it's really difficult to make any other decisions from a place of integrity.
Yeah.
So I have an answer to that question for myself, but I support clients in discovering what that why is.
Okay.
Then we move down into the what, which is like, cool, what are the big chunks of how I want to allocate my attention in my life? What do I want my professional life to look like? Where do I want to live? How do I want my relationship and family life to look like? And my experience is that many of us, most of the time, are navigating some sort of big choice in one of those areas. Some sort of like question around career, some sort of question around relationship, or some sort of question around place, even. And there's other big chunks that we could talk about. So I support clients in that process of feeling into, all right, these big decisions that really make a huge difference in terms of, the quality and direction of my life. How do I make those in a way that's aligned with my deeper vision? And then finally we have the how. And the how is like tactically, from like an hour by hour basis, how do we move through our lives? And that's really where the rubber meets the road. Like if you don't address that level, then nothing really matters in my
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
my take. And so that's where we, get into specific questions about like, wow, okay, I have this pattern of, as soon as I get into a difficult conversation with my spouse, all of a sudden I become really tired and I just shut down, whatever it is. And then I support clients with various tools, being supported by the why and the what to then help them find the most aligned how. And could talk more about like how the frameworks that I have studied in sort of map onto those different levels. Um, but everything that I do as a coach, uh, while we might not be like talking about high level ecological concepts in most coaching sessions, it all comes from the background of like, yeah. And the foundational thing is here, how do we orient towards what I'd call simply like the real world, which is the natural world?
Yeah.
And how do our actions all align towards doing something meaningful in service of that?
So, other than the trips that people go on and experience this firsthand, do you also talk with clients on a weekly or every other week or whatever method on the phone or Zoom to help them figure out these things as well?
Absolutely. So within Vivify, I'm still refining exactly what the next evolution of the program is going to be for Patagonia. But it'll be something like an 8-week program that has group coaching and optional individual coaching to prepare and integrate and really make the most of our week-long experience in the mountains. Now, outside of that, yeah, I work with a number of clients one on one, and the cadence varies, but it's generally like every other week. Usually we meet via Zoom, though I've also found that meeting via phone offers a very different energy to the coaching call. Often, like,
Hmm.
ideally, is like we're both walking outside in a wildish place. And I've often found that those conversations have like more of a sense of like momentum to them than when we're both, sitting looking at each other via a screen. So I've been
Interesting.
experimenting recently with doing calls over the phone and really noticing how like even with the same client and I'm obviously the same coach, it lends a different energy.
Yeah.
Um yeah, that's sort of how I organize
That's
my
really
practice.
interesting. So, if someone listening or watching this is intrigued and thinks it might be their thing, how do they find you? How do they get a hold of you?
Yeah. So the primary website is vivify.life, VIVIFY.life. You can also find me on Substack, where I write about all these topics. So Dom Francks, Francks with a CK at or dot substack.com. Um, and then you can find me on various social media platforms, though I will say that I am still have not figured out the aligned way for me to be consistent on those social media platforms. But if you reach out, I will certainly hear from you. You
Yeah.
can also, yeah, just shoot me an email at dom.franks@gmail.com.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So, Dom, in anticipation of our discussion today, is there anything that I haven't asked you or haven't gotten into that you think is you for sure want to get in the program today?
I think that the last thing that I want to say is like, obviously, we got into some of the fairly overwhelming and difficult topics around like where we're headed as a planet and as a biosphere. And I very intentionally do not shy away from those topics because they are, in my view, the most important thing. And I'm a huge believer in the orientation towards, like I said, falling in love with the natural world and also just orienting towards fun. This is the other thing about spending time in the wilderness with people. It's just so life giving in a way that I think a lot of our world we've substituted things that are sort of deeply and authentically life giving for things that give us cheap thrills. And so, um, yeah, would really invite anyone to reach out, even if they're like, I don't know that I want to come on Vivify, but I would love to just like learn more about how I might integrate the natural world more deeply into my life. Like, please reach out. I would love to have a conversation. Um, and I think with that, yeah, I just really appreciate you taking the time to have me
Yeah.
on, Steve. Thanks so much.
Oh, you're more than welcome. And I just got to tell you that I had another guest on who is trying to save the world from plastic, and she is a marine scientist in North Carolina and does a lot of kind of cleanup, so to speak, of what can we do to kind of get this plastic. It's just amazing to think that in the deepest, darkest recesses of the ocean, they still find particles of plastic. So concerning, as we talked about earlier as well. So Dom, at this point in the interview, I always ask my guests the same common question. So that question is, in relation to leadership, what is a pearl of wisdom that you could leave us with today?
Something like uh, your ability to lead is a direct reflection of your ability to be uncomfortable.
Yeah. No, I
Yeah.
think that's I think it's really interesting that we talked about being uncomfortable and people striving to just be comfortable all the time, you know, I guess is maybe a human natural thing to do. Yet we know from science and what we talked about today and whatever it doesn't necessarily work for peak performance. It's just it's really an interesting concept. And I just had a guest on the other day that talked about that if you look, there's a scientific study that said, because we just went through the Olympics, that people that win or earn the silver medals actually are more successful the rest of their life after that than the gold medal winners, because they had that, dang, I
They're
didn't quite
hungry.
get there. I got to, I got to get to the next level, where the gold medalist is like, oh, this is great, So I think that's just really intriguing that we perform and we reach higher levels of performance when we do deal with adversity and it's not comfortable.
Well, I want to throw one more thing in here on the
Sure.
comfort piece. So, I just recently got absolutely sucked down a rabbit hole of listening to an 11-part podcast series all about the history of the U.S. Army and their wars against the Lakota and the Cheyenne in on the plains in the American West in like the 1860s, 1890s. It was on a podcast called "The Rest Is History," which is uh, perilously entertaining. It definitely was difficult
Hmm.
for me to stop listening to. But the thing that really stuck with me, or one of many things, is the orientation that the Lakota have towards profound pain and discomfort in service of spiritual insight. And this is something that still happens. They do the Sundance,
Hmm.
which has many variations, but one of them, involves having hooks inserted underneath your breast
Yeah.
muscles and then being suspended up in the air and dancing for hours on end with no food and water, praying for a vision.
Yeah.
So I don't think that it's necessarily true that human nature as a whole is oriented towards comfort. I think our society and our value system has built so much of an orientation around comfort and particularly convenience that then we sort of take that to be human nature, but that's not actually true universally. And so that's something that we can rewire. And so then the question that I think, for example, when I was vision fasting with the Animas Valley Institute, the question that they invited us to ask when we felt hungry was like, what do you long for more than food? What is more important to you right now than comfort? And that's a beautiful lens when you put yourself in this uncomfortable situation. I'm like, well, what do I really want? Like, do I want to go to my grave knowing that I was comfortable the whole time? Probably not.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
yeah, something like
Yeah.
that.
Well, this has been a real pleasure, Dom. I mean, it's a topic that, as you said, we just scratch in the surface barely. I think we could, sometimes I think I wish I was Joe Rogan so I could do a 4-hour podcast and pick your brain even more. But, that's not going to happen today. But anyway, really appreciate your time. It sounds like you're just really chasing what you love, which, that alone is worthy, and making helping people see a different way or different perspective, which hopefully results in them having a happier, more successful life too. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. It's a very, very fascinating.
Appreciate it, Steve. Yeah, thanks so much for taking the time to have me on, and it was a pleasure.
Okay, take care and have a good rest of your day.
Alrighty, bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Profiles in Leadership. To listen to all my interviews, subscribe to Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, and many other popular podcast platforms. Some of these interviews are on video, and you can search YouTube for Profiles in Leadership with Steve Anderson. You can also access the entire library of interviews on my website, orange.coaching.com, and that is orangetheword.coaching.com, and go to the Media Center and click on Podcasts or Video Gallery. You can also enter the website from pilpodcast.com.